Hi everyone, my name is Keisha McClintock. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a white woman with red hair and glasses. I am also a PhD candidate at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and today I'll be presenting Lessons from the COVID-19 Pandemic, Reimagining Access Amid Return to Normal Rhetorics. Before I begin, you may have noticed the QR code in the bottom right-hand corner of this presentation screen. That code links to a shareable folder that contains a transcript of this talk, this slideshow, and other relevant materials. It will also remain static throughout this presentation, so feel free to make use of it as you please as I present. This presentation is less directly based on a specific research project and more based on questions I have about cultivating accessible writing program administration. These concerns have emerged because of the return to normal rhetorics that now dominate many public spheres. Rhetorics that ask us to ignore the ongoing and lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and pretend as if it never happened. I know that many of us are tired of discussing the pandemic, that we do in fact want to return to normal, but I think this rush to return to normal ignores the many possibilities that emerged during this time. It felt as if there were new technologies and new strategies for teaching coming out every day. All of them a necessary reconsideration of access in classrooms, in assessment, in teacher training, and in every possible place where access could be reimagined. While the pandemic was also a deeply difficult time that revealed a huge array of inequities, it's also a time that I believe that still holds many lessons for us. I'm also skeptical of the return to normal rhetorics because they feel as if they're based on ableist, white supremacist ideals of what productivity looks like. I resist a return because I don't think we can return. And rather than forcing hegemonic ideals of a normal that is now lost, I'd like to critically think through the last few years as a space for reimagining access in writing program administration. I'm deeply invested in access because I was acting as the WPA in the 2020 year. At UNL, each year, 2 graduate students work with the Director of Composition to train and mentor incoming GTAs on curriculum design and teaching. We also maintain a pedagogical resource website for all the teachers in the department and perform assessment of UNL's various first-year writing courses. I was given this position midway through January 2020, and I had no idea what was waiting just around the corner for me. During the pandemic, the composition team worked really hard. We developed guidelines for shifting to online and hybrid context, guidelines that were circulated not just among the GTAs, but among everyone in our department, as some of our most tenured professors had never taught online before this. We tested out a multitude of technologies in our own classrooms and then turned around and taught the department how to use those technologies. We developed teaching packets that could be applied to a multiple classroom context, reworked our typical week-long GTA fall training course into a 3-day course on Zoom, and we constantly were fielding questions about participation, attendance, best practices, technology, and so many other things. What kept emerging for us again and again was this: what dimensions of access are needed to care for our students? What dimensions of access are needed to care for ourselves? There's a lot of work I did this year that I was proud of, and there's also a lot that I would have done a little bit differently. Like everyone else, we were really just making it up as we were going along, grasping at possibilities wherever they presented themselves. And I'd really like to keep grasping at those possibilities. I think this work is best done by turning to scholars who have already thought deeply about access. In my work, I borrow from queer and disabled scholars, as well as from scholars of color. Not only because this is where some of my identities lie, but because these are scholars who have already deeply thought about access, because access has never been easy for them. Long before the COVID-19 pandemic, these scholars were thinking about access and questioning oppressive hegemonies in writing program administration. For instance, in Vernacular Insurrections, and sorry the quote is a little bit covered up, but you will have a transcript, Carmen Kinder notes that access always means learning the discursive norms and aesthetic rules of a white middle class, the keys to glory. April Bell Baker, and We've Been Knowing, posits that respectability language pedagogies require Black students to project a white middle class identity. Further, ASO-BE-A-NU, an anti-racist assessment ecologies, notes that most so-called proper English or dominant discourses are historically connected to the white body. This makes sense intuitively. We speak with and through our bodies. We write with and through our bodies. As teachers, when we read and evaluate our students' writing, we do so through and with our bodies. And we have in our minds a vision of our students as bodies, as much as we have their language in front of us. Who historically has had the privilege to speak and write the most in civic life and in the academy? Whose words have been validated as history, truth, knowledge, story, the most throughout history? White people. As such, access and education has been defined by students of color's abilities to adhere to a white middle class. And teachers, administrators, and institutions make assessments of this work through the boundaries of whiteness because it has been codified as the norm by society. I can't help but think how this same sort of normalcy that the return to normal rhetorics are enforcing is similar, maybe not as a direct opposition to race, but certainly as a tangible oppression for those whose post-pandemic lives cannot abide by normalcy. Other scholars have addressed similar concerns in thinking of queer bodies. Normalcy often requires not only a certain performance of whiteness, but also of heterosexuality and gender compliance. In the introduction to Writing Program Administration, a queer symposium, William Banks questions whether WPA even grants space for queer and trans bodies. As they note, the failure to reimagine our work has real embodied consequences. It means that queer and trans scholars in our field do not see CWPA as a space that invites them and their experiences in. It means that queer and trans scholars themselves may also struggle to see the connections that exist between their lived experiences, queer/trans rhetorics, and administrative work. And it means that when queer and trans scholars find themselves occupying administrative roles, they may not be prepared to imagine how such spaces both resist their bodies and ideas, and how their bodies and theories might also change those spaces for the better. Returning to normal is nothing but a continuation of this exclusion. And as more politicians push dangerous and oppressive legislators' agendas, especially anti-trans agendas, the more normalized it becomes to really never consider queerness in our thoughts. Most concerning when it comes to access in the pandemic is just how much we re-envisioned access for disabled and chronically ill folks. For these people, myself included, the pandemic is not over and will likely never be over. It still has real and deeply damaging effects on their lives. Yet more and more, we're rolling back all the measures of access that were meant to protect them. In enacting a culture of access in our conference spaces, Ada Hubrick et al. Offer the following. Our definition of access is based on 4 major principles, which reflect access's complexity and liberatory potentials. 1, access is dynamic. 2, access is relational. 3, access is intersectional. And 4, access is political. This understanding of access is our best model for reimagining access and writing program administration, because we can't just return to normal. There are too many body minds and discourses and possibilities that we leave behind when we do so. So is a return to normal really worth it? Obviously, these are deeply important conversations which were happening before the pandemic and continue to happen now. But I think something we are overlooking in all our sort of very valid feelings about the COVID-19 pandemic is that there was possibility within it. We shouldn't take the easy path back to a perceived normal because the perceived normal is full of marginalizations and hegemonic oppressions. But instead, I think what we should do is dwell in the lessons that the COVID-19 pandemic gave us. So rather than leaving this presentation with any sort of specific assertion, I leave you with questions. Questions that I'd like you to think about as you resist return to normal rhetorics, as you reimagine what access can look like in writing program administration. How might we resist capitalistic, racist, and ableist notions of productivity and instead use the lessons of COVID-19 to center access, care, and community? Even as we admit that some normalcies are needed, How did pandemic disruptions reveal means to address institutional marginalizations? And further, how might we foster WPA work that is responsive and imaginative in an ever-changing world? Thank you for your time and consideration of this presentation, and thank you for the time that you will put forward in answering these questions.